Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-do Kim. North Korea carried out its sixth missile test with no sign of stopping its provocative actions. The United States maintains a firm stance condemning North Korea, but at the same time calls on the regime to engage in diplomacy. What is the next move for the United States? We'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Anthony Ruggiero, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. Mr. Ruggiero served as Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and National Security Council Senior Director for Counterproliferation and Biodefense. Scott Snyder is also with me today. Mr. Snyder is Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Welcome to the show. Good to have you both today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So far, North Korea conducted 6 missile tests, starting from ballistic missiles to surface-to-surface tactical guided missiles. They're showing off a range of missiles they have built. Mr. Ruggiero, how do you interpret this? Is this for the research and development purposes, or is this to build up its leverage for possible future talks?
Well, it's probably both. I mean, when they do missile tests or nuclear tests, there's always a technical element of that. They want to ensure that those missiles work. They have done some tests that are simulating what they would need in a complex situation. For example, multiple missile tests at the same time. But I think Kim Jong-un probably got the message last fall that there's no consequences for ballistic missile tests because they were doing them in 2021 and the Biden administration did not respond. So he must think that they're okay. And as you noted, this is an unprecedented level of missile testing in 1 month, even beyond what we saw in 2017. And there's only been one round of sanctions issued so far. So I think the message that Kim is getting is maybe this is okay with the Biden administration.
Mr. Snyder, what do you make of this barrage of missile tests?
Well, the way I see it, North Korea is following the strategic guidance that Kim Jong-un provided in January of last year at the 8th Workers' Party Congress, and really is not concerned about the international reaction. And so I think the thing that we really have to worry about is that he started with these short-range tests, but on the agenda of items that North Korea wants to achieve in the next 5 years, there are solid fuel long-range missile launches, there are satellite launches, there are submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and all of these items, as North Korea moves up that ladder, are more likely to bring North Korea into confrontation with the United States and the international community. And this is really going to generate crisis, and it's going to generate a desire for dialogue to manage the crisis.
Mm-hmm. The United States is responding with stern words. The State Department says the U.S. is taking action alongside the international community while repeatedly stressing it is seeking dialogue with North Korea. Mr. Snyder, is this a proper response?
Well, it's a conventional response, I think, that we've seen for a long time, but it's obviously not sufficient. And I think that's the core challenge here, is that what has been done previously has not worked, and it's going to be necessary to have a more robust response in order both to shape North Korean choices, raise the costs for North Korea to pursue this line of action, and also presumably to try to shape a framework for discussion of these issues that responds more directly to some of North Korea's concerns while also achieving U.S. objectives.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Ruggiero, at this moment, what kind of discussions should be taking place within the U.S. government as to how to respond to these missile tests?
Well, I think the first point is that they have to rebuild the diplomatic coalition. If you look at the readout of Secretary of State Blinken's readout of his call with the Chinese foreign minister a couple of days ago, North Korea is not even mentioned. It's not even mentioned in the readout, which is pretty surprising. I know Ukraine is in the news now, but the fact that a U.S. Secretary of State talked to China after all of these missile tests and after China is holding back any action in the Security Council, it's not even mentioned in the readout, the public readout. That was a mistake. Hopefully it was mentioned in the actual conversation. You go back to January 20, when the strongly worded statement, which there's not even an objectionable word in it, had to be issued by the United States and other countries outside of the Security Council because China and Russia would not allow it to go forward. If you take out Japan, who's not a Security Council member, the United States was only able to get less than half of the members of the Security Council to join that statement that has not an objectionable word. That's a problem. And so certain countries like India and Mexico and Norway did not join that statement. So it indicates to me that they've got to rebuild the diplomatic coalition. And then they need to think about the pressure, the economic pressure, the military pressure, other elements of the pressure campaign that have atrophied under the Biden administration and at the tail end of the Trump administration. They've got a lot of work cut out for them. They need to start moving quickly to get working on it.
When we look back at the time during the Trump administration, no additional sanctions over North Korea's short-range ballistic missile tests were imposed. Mr. Ruggiero, could you explain the logic behind this, since you were in the White House back then? And were you prepared to take actions if North Korea grew more provocative then?
Well, the Trump administration had an interesting set of North Korea policies, right? I would say that the Trump administration one term was equivalent to many two-term presidents, given the change in policy. Really starting with the maximum pressure campaign, then really maximum engagement at the expense of the pressure campaign, and then as North Korea withdrew. As the United States did as well for the presidential election, really the sanctions atrophied, and so the Trump administration unfortunately followed the direction of Trump's many predecessors, where he presided over a failed North Korea policy, and unfortunately the Biden administration is going in the same direction. The unfortunate thing, as I've said numerous other places, is that we fall into this trap of pressure or engagement, and we don't spend a lot of time from a policy perspective developing how do you do both of those at the same time at varying levels of intensity. But that's probably the best policy that will go forward. We'll see if the Biden administration can develop it to implement that kind of policy.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, how would you compare the U.S. government's response during the Trump administration and during the Biden administration?
Well, I think that, as Anthony has already suggested, it's very clear that we see a drop in the priority of North Korea as an issue in the Biden administration. And I think that is part of the problem that the Biden administration has to deal with. I think also, though, that actually the Biden administration is less tolerant of these short-range tests and has sought unsuccessfully to build on the Security Council resolutions that are in place. And that brings us to the, I think, third major difference, and that is the broad emergence of the context of major power rivalry has significantly restricted the amount of help that the Biden administration can expect through the building of an international coalition to address the North Korea issue. So it has to find other mechanisms by which to achieve that goal.
Mm-hmm. Earlier this month, the U.S. government announced unilateral sanctions on North Korean individuals over the recent missile tests. It also pushed for additional sanctions at the United Security Council, although it didn't turn out fruitful. Mr. Snyder, were these actions enough? It doesn't seem to be working so far.
Well, it was necessary, I think, for the U.S. to try to build an international coalition, and the UN Security Council is one mechanism by which to do that. But under current circumstances, where you have non-cooperation from prior partners in China and Russia. We're really in a situation similar to one in which the U.S. has locked the front door and it's being guarded, but there's a moving van at the back door and there's a lot of traffic going in and out. And so the question becomes, is there a way that the U.S. can unilaterally guard the front and back door, or do we need to find additional measures by which to try to achieve our objective beyond the existing sanctions regime?
Mm-hmm. Mr. Ruggiero, how would you assess these sanctions move taken by the Biden administration?
Right, I think Scott's correct there. I mean, the China and Russia think that they are able to control what kind of sanctions are imposed on North Korea. I mean, it's important to reiterate that China and Russia voted for these sanctions. They're some of the most prolific violators of these sanctions. That's not my word. Just read the UN panel of experts report or any other independent assessment of that. And China and Russia know that. In the past, the United States has been able to implement those UN sanctions. Look, Biden did the right thing trying to go through the Security Council. That's not, those doors are closed. So now let's see the United States use its robust authorities to implement these sanctions. In Congress in America today, there's not a lot of things that are bipartisan, right? That pass by overwhelming majorities. One of the few things that has is North Korea sanctions. It passed in 2016, 2017, and 2019. So that is the architecture, that the foundation, if you will, that Biden can use. And what he's going to have to do is to make it hurt for Russia and China. And China has complied when they have been forced with the choice of, are they going to choose North Korea or are they going to choose China? And for those in North Korea who believe that the Chinese are going to choose them, they've been disappointed at every single turn. And that's why I raised the point of, it wasn't even mentioned with the foreign minister. I think that's where it starts. Diplomatically, you've got to start there. And then you've got to start going after, just as they did with Russian company and Russian individuals, going after Chinese individuals, Chinese companies, and if necessary, Chinese banks, to roll back what North Korea has been doing.
So, Mr. Ruggiero, are you saying that the sanctions won't be effective if the United States doesn't pressure China or Russia harder?
Well, that's right. I mean, the bottom line is that we can, the U.S. can go after all these other areas, the non-China, the non-Russia parts of the violations that occur with North Korea sanctions, but in reality, that you're just cleaning up small percentages of what's really going on. In order, you asked the question earlier of what should they be talking about internally beyond the diplomatic coalition they have to rebuild. The other part of that is, okay, when are we going to go after China and Russia in a real way? How are we going to do that? And that starts with warning China and Russia that we're prepared to do that. I mean, President Obama did it, going after a large Chinese operation. President Trump did it, and Biden's going to have to do it as well. If they're serious about this, if they're not serious, if they're interested in another strategic patience policy and just hoping that North Korea doesn't do anything too upsetting, then they won't do that. But if they're serious about it, that's what it's going to come down to.
Mr. Snyder, what do you think? Is the Biden administration willing to go far to really hold China accountable for this?
Well, I would say that it's complicated because it's not clear that the Biden administration has the necessary tools to hold China accountable. An alternative approach involving diplomacy would be to try to compartmentalize the North Korea issue from the other issues in the U.S.-China relationship. But unfortunately, I think that strategy also has a low chance of success under current circumstances. And so I do think the Biden administration has a real dilemma because it needs cooperation from China and, of course, from Russia. And the prospects of cooperation with Russia are quite low in the context of a potential imminent invasion of Ukraine in order to achieve success on North Korea, or it has to find other options. And those might involve looking more closely at ways of inducing failure in the North Korean program. And another component might involve cyber operations, such as the dedicated denial of service attacks that we saw reports on involving North Korea also this past week.
From what we have discussed so far, realistically, imposing multilateral sanctions through the UN mechanism seems to be very difficult. Mr. Snyder, is there any other way to pressure North Korea?
Well, what I was just trying to point to is that we have to go beyond sanctions at this point. And I think that the discussion of sanctions has occupied a lot of time and attention. It's an important instrument, but I think we've reached a point where we have to look beyond sanctions to other instruments that can complement the sanctions effort in order to try to achieve our objectives toward North Korea.
Mr. Ruggiero, would it be possible for the U.S. to persuade other countries to impose their own unilateral sanctions? Would that work?
Well, I think they're going to do that. I think that there is room for multilateral sanctions, even from China and Russia. As I think Scott and I are both describing, this sort of North Korea escalation ladder, which he and I have both experienced multiple times over the last couple of decades. If Kim and the Kim regime go for an ICBM test or a nuclear test, that will make it easier for the Biden administration. Traditionally, the United States has gotten UN Security Council resolutions after those kinds of tests. So that's even a red line for China and Russia. I mean, I agree with Scott that we need to look at the full spectrum of potential pressure, not just the financial sanctions, which do get a lot of focus. Though I will say that there is still room for that, and if you don't implement the financial sanctions, then you actually do need to think through like the military aspect of that. Are you trying to physically implement those sanctions with regard to the coal transfers and the refined petroleum transfers? Is it better to do it that way in terms of the physical interdiction of those things, or to target those networks inside of China and Russia that are allowing those transactions to take place? I favor the latter, and then holding the former back in reserve if the former doesn't, or excuse me, if the latter, the physical sanctions winds up becoming necessary.
All right.
Can I just jump in? I mean, I think that Anthony, what he lays out is quite reasonable, but I just want to caution against the idea that somehow we can rely on North Korea escalation to bring China back into our corner, because we're facing a different geostrategic context in the context of major power rivalry at this point. And so I think that it would be a mistake for the Biden administration to assume that North Korea is going to escalate its way into a unified international opposition against its current behaviors.
I have a slightly different take than Scott in the sense of, I understand this is a different geostrategic outline here, with particular with China and Russia. But at the end of the day, it does come down to if the Chinese want to continue to have access to the U.S. financial system, they can't do that while continuing to work with North Korea. And so, if the Biden administration is willing to make it that clear, and the same with Russia, I think in the past we've had these concerns that China will ask for something, or in the U.S.-China relationship, it will become a problem. But in general, the small times we have actually put that on the table where they have to choose North Korea or the United States, they choose access to the U.S. financial system.
Meanwhile, there was a news report from South Korea that Philip Goldberg, a career diplomat, has been tapped to serve as new U.S. ambassador to South Korea. Goldberg served as coordinator for implementation of UN Security Council resolution on North Korea. Mr. Snyder, if he was really named, do you think this gives some indications of how the Biden administration perceives North Korea?
Not really. I think that the policy has already been formed, and Ambassador Goldberg is a seasoned career professional. His direct experience was related to sanctions implementation toward North Korea, and that is a benefit, I think, as he moves into a new job, if he's confirmed. But I think that it's also the case that as a career professional, he knows he's got a whole host of issues to manage in the U.S.-South Korea relationship, and that he has to be part of a team that has already been formed, that has already created a framework for policy in the Biden administration. So if you're in that position, your opportunity for influence is very evolutionary, and it's dependent on building credibility with the team.
Sure. Mr. Ruggiero, what did you think about this news?
Well, hopefully he'll be in place before the inauguration of the new South Korean president. I think that will be useful. I think the other added benefit beyond just the North Korea sanctions angle is that South Korea plays a large role in Iran sanctions implementation as well. So I think having someone with that knowledge and the nuance, I agree with Scott. I mean, the policy itself is made in Washington, D.C., and ambassadors are generally implementing that policy. But there is a benefit to having someone of his stature. He's the highest, he's the highest rank in the Foreign Service, career ambassador. He's been ambassador to several different countries, so he has a lot of experience in that regard. But unless the Biden administration decides to, have him take a larger role outside the traditional ambassador to South Korea role with regard to North Korea policy, that's primarily going to be made, either with Sung Kim or, with in Washington, D.C. But it's good to see that the administration, a year later, over a year into their administration, has finally nominated or about to nominate someone for ambassador to South Korea.
Mm-hmm. My last question for today. It's already end of January. Do you expect to see more provocations from North Korea and a lot of diplomacy happening this year? Mr. Ruggiero first.
Well, we have a couple more days left in January, right? So we'll see if we get any more. But unfortunately, I agree with what Scott said earlier, that we're probably in the escalation ladder. Who knows where it goes? But it's unclear if Kim is ready to talk. I will say that I think he's waiting to see what happens with the Iran negotiations, which the Biden administration, if you believe the rumors, is going to give near full sanctions relief to a country that does not yet have a nuclear weapon, and will do less than what that country agreed to in 2015. I think if you're Kim Jong-un, if that comes through, that's good news for you. And so I think he's probably waiting to see if he could get something of a similar deal, which would allow him likely to preserve much of his nuclear program.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder.
I think it's possible we might see a pause in the context of the Winter Olympics, but not a change in direction. And what I would focus on internationally actually is the prospect of escalation of conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and the risk that North Korea might pursue opportunism in the context of U.S. distraction.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is reportedly in consultations with his counterparts in South Korea and Japan over having an in-person meeting in February, with North Korea being on the top of the agenda. Many are keen to find out whether these three countries will be able to coordinate and come up with some creative ways to deal with North Korea. Mr. Ruggiero and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having me.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.